Have you ever had that uncomfortable feeling of sitting at a table with friends or family, everyone looking at their phones, and feeling that although they are physically close, something fundamental has been lost? Or maybe you have experienced that revealing moment when, in the middle of a work meeting full of corporate jargon and productivity goals, you silently ask yourself, is this really what matters in life? Is this why we are here? If you have ever felt this, you are not alone. In fact, this experience of awakening to a deeper reality amid the distractions and superficialities of the modern world is becoming increasingly common. And interestingly, the more people go through this awakening, the more they tend to distance themselves from conventional social structures and dynamics. Today, we are going to explore this fascinating phenomenon. Why those who awaken to a deeper consciousness are gradually disappearing from what we consider mainstream society. To understand this, we must first look back long before smartphones, social media, and even industrial civilization to understand how we got here. For most of human history, our species lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers, where the experience of reality was direct and immediate. There was no significant separation between the individual and their community, between humans and the natural world. Human consciousness was completely immersed in the present experience, in direct contact with other human beings and with the natural environment. People did not need abstract theories about the meaning of life or self-help manuals to know how to live. They simply lived, responding to the immediate needs of survival, reproduction, and social cooperation. Of course, that does not mean that our ancestors lived in an idyllic paradise. Life was harsh, often brutal, and frequently short. Predators, hunger, disease, tribal conflicts, these threats were constant. But there was an authenticity in the human experience, a direct connection with reality that many of us today long to recover, even without clearly realizing what we are seeking. The Great Transformation began about 10,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture. For the first time, humans began systematically manipulating their environment, transforming entire landscapes to serve their purposes. With agriculture came settlement, population growth, labor specialization, social hierarchy, the accumulation of wealth, and eventually the emergence of the first civilizations. This was a turning point in the history of human consciousness. We began to move further and further away from direct contact with the natural world and to live in increasingly artificial and controlled environments. Our time and attention came to be regulated not by the natural rhythms of day and night, of the seasons of the year, but by abstractions such as the calendar and the clock. And as society became more complex, new layers of mediation arose between us and direct reality. Written language, money, laws, bureaucracies, rigid social hierarchies. Each of these innovations represented a new level of abstraction, a new filter through which we began to experience reality. This process of distancing from direct experience and immersion in realities, mediated by abstractions, continued and accelerated dramatically with the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, millions of people left the countryside, where they still maintained some connection with natural cycles, to live in industrial cities, working in factories, following the rhythm dictated by machines. Human time, which once followed the rhythm of the seasons and the sun, came to be rigidly controlled by the factory clock. The sensory experience, which had previously been shaped mainly by contact with the natural world, became dominated by the urban environment, by machines, by constant noise, by smoke, by confinement, and then we arrived in the information age. The digital revolution and the mediation of human experience reached unprecedented levels. Today, for many of us, especially in developed urban societies, practically the entire experience of reality is filtered through layers and more layers of abstraction and technological mediation. We spend most of our waking hours looking at screens, interacting not with real people in physical environments, but with digital representations in virtual environments. Our experience of the world is increasingly shaped by algorithms designed to maximize our engagement, not our well-being or our understanding of reality. Our social interactions are mediated by platforms that transform human relationships into commodities, quantifiable in likes, shares, and followers. And the most disturbing thing is that these mediations are not neutral, they are impregnated with the values and goals of the economic and political systems that created them. In a global capitalist economy, the technologies that mediate our experience are designed primarily to serve market interests, increase consumption, maximize labor productivity, collect data for targeted advertising. In authoritarian systems, these same technologies are adapted to serve the interests of state control, mass surveillance, manipulation of public opinion, suppression of dissent. In both cases, the technological mediation of human experience serves objectives that are often in tension, if not in direct contradiction, with the deepest human needs for authentic connection, meaning, and autonomy. And it is precisely here that we find the root of the phenomenon we are exploring today. Why those who awaken to a deeper consciousness tend to move away from conventional society? Because awakening in this context means recognizing and beginning to free oneself from these layers of mediation, these filters that distort our experience of reality. It means realizing that much of what we consider normal, necessary, or inevitable in our society is in fact a relatively recent construction in human history, and often a construction that serves interests that are not our own. Let us consider what awakening really means in this context. I am not talking about some esoteric, mystical experience, although that can also happen. I am talking about a very concrete and practical awakening to the nature of the social, economic, and technological structures that shape our daily experience, and how these structures often alienate us from our most fundamental human needs. This awakening can begin in many different ways. For some people, it begins with an existential crisis, a moment when they stop and ask, is this it? Is this what I am living for? For others, it may begin with a physical or mental breakdown when the body or psyche simply refuses to continue functioning within the parameters imposed by society. It may begin with the recognition of the global ecological crisis and the realization that our current economic system is literally destroying the biophysical foundations that sustain human life. Or it may begin with the observation of the profound inequalities and injustices embedded in our social structures, and the moral dissatisfaction with a system that values some lives much more than others. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we are discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you also lie awake at night thinking about it? I know that many times we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps for fear of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your concerns are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments, my greatest fear about our technological future is. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to face them. Regardless of how it begins, awakening generally involves a radical questioning of the dominant narratives that shape our society. The narrative that perpetual economic growth is possible and desirable on a finite planet, the narrative that a person's value is determined by their economic productivity or social status, the narrative that happiness comes from consumption and material accumulation, the narrative that technology alone will solve all our problems. The more someone questions these narratives, the more they begin to see the contradictions and hidden costs of the social system we live in. And upon seeing this, it becomes increasingly difficult to participate in that system in the same way as before. That is why those who awaken often begin to withdraw to varying degrees from the structures and activities they once considered normal and necessary. But here we find an interesting paradox. On the one hand, this distancing may seem superficially like a form of escapism or denial of social reality. In fact, this is how this behavior is often interpreted and labeled by mainstream culture, as a failure to grow up, to face reality, to contribute to society. But from a deeper perspective, we can see that this distancing often represents not an escape from reality, but a search for a more authentic and direct way of experiencing it. Those who awaken are not denying the existence of society or trying to escape from it completely, which would be impossible. Instead, they are trying to rediscover ways of existing and relating that are not completely mediated and distorted by the abstractions and systems that dominate contemporary society. They are seeking a way of life that is more aligned with the fundamental human needs for connection, meaning, autonomy, and contact with the natural world. And this inevitably means a certain disconnection from conventional social structures that are antithetical to these needs. Let us consider some concrete examples of how this distancing manifests. In the world of work, those who awaken often begin to deeply question contemporary corporate culture, with its emphasis on competition, productivity at all costs, infinite growth. They may choose to work fewer hours, shift to more meaningful and less lucrative careers, or abandon the corporate path entirely to start independent ventures more aligned with their values. They may refuse to participate in business practices they consider unethical or harmful, even if it means sacrificing career advancement opportunities. In the realm of consumption, those who awaken often drastically reduce their participation in the consumer economy. They recognize that the endless cycle of working, spending, discarding, and working more to spend more is a form of modern servitude that does not lead to genuine satisfaction. Instead, they tend to favor voluntary simplicity, conscious consumption, reuse and repair, local and community production of goods and services. In the digital world, awakening often manifests as a critical re-evaluation of our relationship with technology. Those who awaken may choose to drastically reduce screen time, limit the use of social media, practice regular digital detox, or adopt simpler and less invasive technologies. They recognize that mainstream digital platforms are designed to capture and monetize our attention, not to promote our well-being or autonomy. In the political sphere, awakening often leads to a distancing from conventional forms of political participation, which are increasingly perceived as superficial and co-opted by powerful interests. Instead, those who awaken may engage in more direct forms of political and social action, grassroots movements, cooperatives, community exchanges, alternative systems of local governance. They understand that real change rarely comes from above, from existing power structures, but from building viable alternatives from the bottom up. In terms of housing and location, awakening often manifests as an exodus from large metropolises to rural or peri-urban areas, where it is easier to grow food, form intentional communities, live closer to nature, and escape the ubiquitous surveillance and control of modern cities. Or it may manifest as the creation of alternative living enclaves within cities themselves, housing cooperatives, urban eco-villages, intentional communities, occupations. In education, those who awaken often withdraw their children from conventional schools, which are increasingly perceived as institutions focused not on developing full human beings, but on producing obedient workers and consumers for the economic system. Instead, they opt for homeschooling, democratic schools, forest schools, self-directed learning, and other alternative educational approaches that respect children's autonomy and natural curiosity. And in social and family relationships, awakening often leads to a re-evaluation of which relationships are truly nurturing and which are maintained only by social obligation or emotional dependency. Those who awaken tend to cultivate smaller but deeper social circles based on shared values and mutual support, rather than superficial networks of professional contacts or casual acquaintances. They may distance themselves from toxic or superficial family relationships or work to transform them into something more authentic and mutually beneficial. In all these areas, we see the same pattern: a distancing from conventional structures perceived as alienating, dehumanizing, or simply misaligned with deeper values, and a search for alternatives that allow a more authentic, connected, and meaningful way of life. It is important to emphasize that this distancing is rarely total or absolute. Most people who experience this kind of awakening do not completely withdraw from society to live as hermits in caves. Instead, they negotiate a complex balance between participation and distancing, finding ways to exist within the larger society without being completely defined or controlled by its structures. They may participate in the formal economy when necessary, but also cultivate alternative economies based on exchange, gifting, cooperation. They may use digital technologies, but in a conscious and controlled way, not as passive users, but as active agents who choose how, when, and why to engage with these tools. They may interact with governmental institutions when necessary, but also build parallel structures of community governance and mutual support. But even this partial distancing, this conscious repositioning in relation to dominant structures, is often enough to make these people less visible in the context of mainstream society. They simply do not appear as much in the spaces and activities that define conventional social life. They are less present on social media, in corporate cultures, in shopping centers, in television audiences, in conventional political processes. And when they do appear in these spaces, they are often present in different ways, less recognizable by conventional standards. It is also important to recognize that this kind of awakening and distancing is not equally accessible to everyone. People with economic, social, or educational privilege have much more capacity to step away from conventional structures without facing severe consequences. Someone with substantial financial resources may choose to work less or in ways more aligned with their values. Someone with high cultural and educational capital has more tools to critically analyze dominant narratives and imagine alternatives. Someone with a strong social network can rely on support during periods of transition and experimentation. On the other hand, those living in economic precariousness, who face systemic discrimination, who do not have access to quality education or solid support networks, have much less room to question or distance themselves from dominant structures. For many, full participation in conventional economic and social systems is not a choice, but a necessity for survival. And this creates a paradoxical situation. Those who suffer most from the dysfunctions of the current system are often the ones who can least afford to seek alternatives. This is one of the reasons why those who awaken, especially those with privilege, often direct part of their energy toward working for the transformation of dominant systems, not only for their own well-being, but for broader social justice. They understand that true liberation cannot be only individual, but must be collective. This leads us to another important aspect of this phenomenon. Awakening is rarely purely individual. In fact, it often occurs in social contexts, in communities of practice, in broader cultural and political movements. Historically, we can see many examples of this. The counterculture movements of the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds, intentional communities and eco-villages that emerged in recent decades, contemporary movements for climate justice, food sovereignty, decolonization, anti-capitalism, direct democracy. In all these cases, we see groups of people awakening together to the dysfunctions of dominant systems and collectively seeking alternative ways of living and relating. And this brings us to a crucial question. Does this phenomenon of awakening and distancing represent a marginal trend destined to remain on the edges of society? Or could it eventually catalyze a broader social transformation? To answer this question, we need to consider the forces driving this awakening and which are likely to continue intensifying in the coming years. First, we have the growing evidence of the dysfunctions and contradictions of our current systems. The climate crisis, the mass extinction of species, widespread pollution, extreme and growing inequalities, mental health crises, political polarization, corporate capture of democratic institutions. All of this makes it increasingly difficult to believe that our current socioeconomic system is sustainable or desirable in the long term. As these crises intensify, more people will likely awaken to the need for fundamental change. Second, we have the very nature of contemporary digital technology, which simultaneously intensifies our alienation and provides us with tools to overcome it. On one hand, dominant digital platforms designed to maximize profit through attention capture tend to promote superficial engagement, narcissism, social comparison, polarization, and fragmented attention. On the other hand, these same technologies enable new forms of connection, collaboration, knowledge sharing, and collective organization that can facilitate awakening and the search for alternatives. Third, we have the internal contradictions of global capitalism, which simultaneously promises freedom, fulfillment, and abundance, but delivers precariousness, alienation, and environmental degradation to the majority. As these contradictions become more evident with the economic system requiring continuous consumption, even while wages stagnate and job security diminishes, more people are likely to question the dominant narratives that uphold this system. Fourth, we have the growing crisis of meaning and purpose in modern secular societies. In a world where traditional religions and grand unifying narratives have lost much of their strength, but where the alternatives offered by consumerism, careerism, and entertainment prove increasingly empty, many people are hungry for deeper and more meaningful ways of living. This spiritual and existential hunger may drive more awakenings in the coming years. And finally, we have the power of social contagion and network effects. The more people awaken and begin living differently, the more visible and accessible these alternative paths become to others. Each person who awakens and finds more satisfying ways of living becomes a potential catalyst for the awakening of others in their social circle. Considering all these forces, it is plausible that the phenomenon of awakening and distancing from conventional social structures will continue to grow and expand in the coming years. What is less clear is whether this growth will follow a linear pattern, with more and more individuals gradually stepping away, or whether it will eventually reach a critical mass that could precipitate a more fundamental and abrupt transformation of dominant systems. History shows us that social transformations rarely follow predictable trajectories. Complex systems, like human societies, often appear stable until suddenly they are not. Tipping points are reached, cascades of change accelerate, and what once seemed marginal suddenly becomes mainstream. But it is also true that dominant systems have powerful forces of inertia and self-preservation mechanisms. Established institutions, entrenched economic interests, deeply rooted cultural narratives, all of these forces resist fundamental change. And the technological and economic systems we are questioning are themselves incredibly adaptable, capable of co-opting and commodifying even the movements that emerge in opposition to them. Think, for example, of how consumer capitalism quickly absorbed and commercialized the counterculture of the 1960 seconds, turning symbols of rebellion into mass market commodities, or how large technology corporations appropriated the rhetoric of community, connection, and empowerment to sell platforms that often end up promoting the opposite. However, we can also see that the converging crises we face today, from climate destabilization to political polarization, from automation to ubiquitous surveillance, are of a magnitude different from past challenges. They threaten not just specific aspects of our social systems, but their very foundations. In this context, the awakening and distancing we are discussing may represent not merely an individual adaptive response to dysfunctional social conditions, but the first signs of a more fundamental social transformation that is only beginning to take shape. What form might this transformation take? It is impossible to predict with certainty, but we can discern some potential outlines. One possible scenario is what we might call social bifurcation, the growing divergence between those who remain immersed in conventional systems and those who are creating parallel alternative worlds. In this scenario, we do not see a single revolutionary transformation of dominant systems, but the gradual emergence of parallel social, economic, and cultural spheres operating according to different logics and values. These alternative spheres may eventually become robust and self-sufficient enough to allow a growing number of people to live primarily within them, with only peripheral involvement in dominant systems. Another possible scenario is what we might call transformation by infiltration. Those who awaken do not completely step away from dominant systems, but work to transform them from within, bringing new values, practices, and structures into existing institutions. In this scenario, we see a gradual shift in organizational culture, in companies, in pedagogical practices, in schools, in the operation of markets and governments, not through abrupt revolution, but through persistent influence and demonstrative examples of viable alternatives. A third scenario is what we might call recovery of ancestral knowledge. Contemporary awakening leads to renewed interest and respect for forms of knowledge, social practices, and relationships with the natural world that existed before industrial modernity. In this scenario, we see the revitalization of indigenous traditions, pre-industrial community practices, and non-Western philosophies, not as a romantic return to the past, but as sources of wisdom for navigating the challenges of the present and future. Of course, these scenarios are not mutually exclusive. In reality, we will likely see elements of all of them, and others we cannot yet anticipate, unfolding simultaneously and interacting in complex ways. The crucial point is that the phenomenon of awakening and distancing we are discussing today is not merely a marginal trend or a sociological curiosity. It is potentially the beginning of a deeper social transformation whose contours we are only beginning to discern. But whatever form this transformation eventually takes, it will certainly involve a fundamental renegotiation of our relationship with technology. And that brings us back to the central question that motivated our exploration today. Why are those who awaken to a deeper consciousness disappearing from conventional society? The answer, as we have seen, is multifaceted. They are distancing themselves because they recognize that many of the structures and practices that define mainstream society are fundamentally alienating, dehumanizing, or simply misaligned with deeper human needs. They are distancing themselves because they are seeking ways of life that allow more authentic connection, deeper meaning, greater autonomy, and more direct contact with the natural world. They are distancing themselves because they are trying to create and cultivate alternatives to the dominant systems they consider unsustainable, unjust, or spiritually impoverishing. This distancing is not an abandonment of society itself, but an attempt to rediscover and rebuild forms of human sociability that are not completely mediated and distorted by dominant economic, political, and technological systems. It is a search for ways of being human together that honor our interdependence not only with one another, but with the entire web of life on Earth. And it is ultimately an expression of hope. The hope that even in the face of the multiple crises we face, it is still possible to create ways of life that are not only sustainable, but truly prosperous, not only for a privileged few humans, but for the entire community of life. If these reflections have touched something you have been feeling, but perhaps had not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the big questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us on this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. Remember, awakening is not the end of the journey, but only the beginning. What we do after awakening, how we translate our expanded consciousness into concrete ways of living, loving, and creating together, that is what truly matters. And it is a question that we can only answer collectively through continuous dialogue, courageous experimentation, and the patient building of new worlds inside the shell of the old. Thank you for joining this exploration with me today. I hope it has sparked not only thoughts, but also a renewed sense of possibility and purpose. Until next time.
I go to therapy every week. I have a weekly session. People can wonder, why do people need to go to therapy? The subject matter in therapy is myself. Who knows myself better than me? Why do I need to go to some stranger to learn about myself? This is ridiculous. But it's not. Because yes, I know more about myself than any other person perhaps, but there are so many things I don't want to know about myself. I have access to all the data, to the memories, to the daily events, but I reject some things I really like to know about myself, but the more painful, the darker episodes in my life, the more painful things I do in the present, it's very difficult for a person to acknowledge that about oneself. If you're in a relationship and there is a problem in a relationship, you ask and people would say, I'm perfect. It's the other person who is causing all the problem. If only the other person changed a little, behaved differently, everything would be perfect. And you ask the other person, they would say exactly the same thing. I'm perfect. It's my husband, it's my wife that is causing all the problem in our household. So this is why I need to go to therapy, to get professional help, to realize some very deep truths about yourself that are too difficult or too painful to acknowledge. History is like therapy for entire civilizations or for the whole of humankind. Also, entire nations often don't want to acknowledge dark episodes in their past or dark things they are doing right now. Entire civilizations, the same. You ask, and almost every nation, almost every country would say, we are perfect. All the problems are because of the other nations. All the problems are because of the other civilizations, of the other cultures. I think the responsible job of historians to simply help people understand better the big processes and the deep sources of the problems in the world. And this is a big responsibility.
AI should never pretend to be a human being. All this talk about freedom of speech is in many ways misleading because only humans have freedom of speech. But on platforms like X, like TikTok, like many others, the ones who actually control the platforms are AIs. I don't think that companies should censor what humans say on social media. Should be very careful about that. But so many people are saying so many things, and the ones who choose which posts to promote, who magnify the message, they are algorithms, not human beings. There should not be any protection of freedom of speech for the algorithms because the algorithms don't have freedom of speech.
So you're all for banning algorithms and bots?
No, not for banning them, but for regulating them. One key regulation is that an AI should never pretend to be a human being. If you are interacting with somebody online, you should be able to know if it's an AI or not. It's okay to interact with AIs, but on condition that it reveals it is an AI.
Most information in the world is junk.
In just a word or two, explain why modern AI might destroy democracy.
The key issue is that democracy is based on trust, whereas dictatorship is based on terror. This extremely cynical view of humans is not true.
What you've done in your recent book, Nexus.
The book is about the history of information.
To offer a different lens for information.
Information isn't truth. It's not a question of helpful or dangerous. It's the magnitude of the change. We need more boring politicians, for instance.
For sure.
Suffering is the rejection of reality. One of the last stories that still connects everybody is the story of money.
This whole problem becomes much greater with AI.
AIs can make decisions. They are not just tools in our hands, they are agents creating new realities.
$7,000, $25,000 unarmed civilian. Keep it like you know.